I never thought being a good father would end with my son nodding while his wife called me toxic. It was a cold Thursday afternoon in early March. I remember because I had just come in from the garage, still had the chill of concrete on my fingers when Paige turned to Ryan, casual, like she was asking what we'd have for dinner, and said, "Your father is toxic for this family. He needs to go." And he didn't even flinch. He didn't ask for clarity, didn't tell her to watch her mouth or take a breath. He just nodded like it was overdue. "Maybe it's for the best, Dad." He said it quiet, almost kind. That made it worse. I didn't speak. I didn't pack in a fury. I just walked upstairs, opened the cedar closet, and pulled out the same weekender bag I'd used on our last family trip to Prescott, back when Paige still smiled at me and Ryan still called me Dad without sounding like it hurt his teeth. I filled it with exactly what I needed: jeans, boots, razors, paperwork. Left everything else behind, even the boots June bought me 2 Christmases ago. I couldn't stand the thought of dragging her memory through this mess. I moved into a duplex in Flagstaff. Cheap, cold tile floors, one working burner on the stove, and a ceiling fan that ticked like a metronome. The kind of place where you forget what day it is until the noise from the neighbor's TV reminds you it's Sunday again. I didn't furnish it, didn't hang anything on the walls. That place wasn't home. It was holding space. Exactly 7 days later, my prepaid phone lit up. 53 missed calls. But it was final. Paige had said what she meant. Ryan had agreed. And me? I left quietly. But I didn't forget. That moment on the couch. Paige's voice. Ryan's silence. It didn't come out of nowhere. It was just the final crack in a wall that had been eroding all year. They didn't move in with malice. Not at first. "Just for a few weeks," Ryan said last spring when their condo flooded. "You've got the space, Dad, and you could use the company." I remember standing in the driveway, watching their SUV pull up. Paige waved through the windshield like she was already home. I told myself I was doing the right thing. Helping family. Giving my son the stability I wished someone had given me when I was starting out. June would have said yes too. She always believed people needed room to start again. But they didn't start again. They spread. Her throw pillows replaced mine. The pantry filled with snacks I didn't recognize. One day the garage door opener was reprogrammed without me knowing. Ryan said it was for convenience. Another day I walked in and found Madison's sister, the one with the voice like a mosquito, doing yoga in my living room like she'd paid rent. It happened inch by inch. Then came the temporary use of my accounts. First a utility bill, then the just to cover a gap bank transfers. I didn't raise hell. I asked questions. I got chuckles in return. "Dad, it's all family money," Ryan said one night, flipping through my mail like it belonged to him. Why make it weird? Maybe I could have said no harder. Maybe I should have pushed back. But part of me still wanted to believe we were in the same story, that father and son were working toward the same ending. The day I knew I was wrong came without warning. I was cleaning out the file drawer in the hallway, looking for June's old will, just to see something in her handwriting when I found it. A copy of a power of attorney document with my signature on it. Except I didn't remember signing it. I don't forget my own pen strokes. I don't forget legal forms. I don't forget giving someone the power to speak for me in courts or banks or hospitals. It was already too late. They hadn't just moved in, they'd moved me out. By the time I found that forged power of attorney, the cracks had already become patterns. The little things I kept brushing off had names now. And wait, Ryan had stopped calling me Dad months earlier. I didn't notice it right away. It was gradual. At first, it was Richard when he was frustrated, short, clipped, like I was an annoying client he had to deal with. Then it just became routine. "Richard, did you move the truck?" "Richard." The water bill came. He hadn't called me Dad since Christmas. Paige didn't bother with subtlety. She treated the house like it was a Pinterest board she hadn't finished designing. She had the living room walls repainted, called the old color depressing. She tore down June's sun catchers in the breakfast nook, said they looked cheap. I found them stuffed in a donation box in the garage. The garden was the one thing I asked her not to touch. I told her that plainly. That June had planted those roses by hand. That she named them Elizabeth, Marion, Ruth, after her sisters. Paige smiled and said, "Of course." Then 2 weeks later, she had landscapers tear it all out. They replaced it with an outdoor bar, concrete, string lights, a fire pit, the kind of thing you see in Instagram photos under hashtags like #weekendvibes. I stood there on the porch that evening, staring at where the roses used to be, and something inside me folded in half. But I didn't yell. I didn't ask why. I already knew the answer. Paige never saw memories, only upgrades. The final straw came 3 days later. I walked into the garage looking for a screwdriver. My tools were gone, all of them. My craftsman chest, my router and lathe, even the folding stool I used when my knees got stiff. I asked Ryan where they were. He didn't look up from his phone. "We sold them." I stared at him. He said Paige wants to downsize the garage, make room for a home gym. I couldn't speak. I walked out. Not just from the garage, from the conversation, from the belief that they were just confused, just temporary, just inconsiderate. They'd sold my tools, my Navy chest, my signed Tom Landry photo. They thought they'd backed me into a corner, that I'd keep nodding, keep disappearing, keep folding my life into smaller and smaller spaces until I no longer existed in theirs. What they didn't know, what they never bothered to ask, was that I've never trusted computers. Not with the important things. Buried inside an old army footlocker, wrapped in a towel beneath my winter coats, was a leather-bound ledger. Black cover, thick spine, pages yellowed at the edges. I started it the year June, and I bought the house. Back then it was just receipts and mortgage notes. Over time, it became everything. Every transaction, every wire transfer, every login credential I ever used, every call I made to the bank when something didn't sit right. Taped into the back cover was a list of every item in my garage, logged and dated, including the serial numbers on my tools. I even had photos, not because I planned for this, but because life teaches you that anything not written down will be forgotten when you need it most. They had power of attorney. I had paper. I had proof. In the back of that ledger was a manila envelope, one I hadn't opened in years. Inside, copies of our estate documents, June's original will, a notarized copy of our revocable trust, and the business card of the only lawyer we'd ever trusted with the hard stuff, Elaine Morris. I hadn't spoken to her in almost a decade, but I kept the card. June always said, "Keep good people close, even if you don't need them yet." I stared at the number for a long time before dialing. Her voice hadn't changed. Sharp, direct, no wasted words. "Elaine, it's Richard Ashland." A pause. Then, "Well, that's a name I haven't heard in years. You okay?" "No, but I've got documentation. And I think I've been robbed." "Robbed how?" "They used my name to sign something I never touched. And they'd been using my money to build a life I was never invited into." She didn't gasp. She didn't offer pity. She said, "Email me everything. Scans, photos, dates. We start now." I hung up the phone and looked at the ledger on the table. It didn't feel like a diary anymore. Elaine Morris still worked out of the same corner office above Prescott Plaza, same plate glass window overlooking the clock tower. Same framed certificate behind her desk, only now with more dust around the edges. She didn't hug me. She didn't ask how the family was doing. She just pulled out her reading glasses, took the folder I handed her, and flipped it open. First page, the forged power of attorney. Second, my handwritten ledger pages, scanned and labeled. Third, the summary I typed the night before, bullet points and dates. Everything from the utility transfers to the downsizing of my garage. Elaine didn't make a sound. Her eyes tracked line after line, jaw tightening with each turn of the page. She got to the last sheet and sat back in her chair. "Did you authorize this POA?" "No." "Was it notarized?" "No. Not legally, anyway. There's no stamp. Just a shaky signature that's supposed to be mine." She tapped her pen once against her notepad, then again. "Then we've got forgery. That's criminal. If they submitted it to a bank or a title office, that's financial fraud on top of elder coercion." She paused, then flipped back to the copy of June's trust agreement. "You remember this clause?" she asked, tapping her pen under a highlighted section. I leaned forward. It had been years. I'd forgotten the details, but the line was right there in black and white. Should any listed beneficiary commit fraud, coercion, or misrepresentation against the grantor, they shall be considered legally ineligible to receive any trust assets, and reversion shall apply. Elaine looked up. "If we can prove this was done while you were mentally fit, and we can, I'll make sure of it. Then they didn't just commit fraud." She tapped the paper again, softer this time. "They triggered a clause they never knew existed." That was when it hit me. They thought they'd outsmarted an old man with soft boundaries and bad knees. But June never trusted easy, and Elaine never forgot a clause. Elaine didn't sugarcoat anything. She never had. That's why June trusted her, and why I showed up in her office instead of trying to figure this mess out on my own. She closed the folder, sat back, and folded her hands. "Let me be plain, Richard. This isn't just a family squabble. It's forgery, misappropriation of assets, and coercion while you're still legally of sound mind. That gives us teeth." I nodded, but part of me still didn't want to believe it had come to this. I didn't raise Ryan to be the kind of man who needed lawyers to remind him what decency looked like. Elaine leaned forward. "There's more. Remember the conditional clause in June's trust? The one most families forget even exists?" I did now. "If we can prove malicious intent, meaning they used the power of attorney to siphon funds or take property without your informed consent, we can activate the reversion clause. That means the house, the accounts, the rights of executor, all of it reverts to you, clean. And Ryan? Legally disqualified as a beneficiary of your late wife's trust. Permanently." It hit harder than I thought it would. Not because I didn't want it. I did. But because part of me still remembered the boy who cried when he couldn't tie his shoes, and the man who shook when he held Lily for the first time. But the man who stood silent while Paige gutted June's garden? That man wasn't crying, he was calculating. Elaine opened her drawer and pulled out a pen. "Here's what we're going to do," she said. "First, I'll get you a clean psychological evaluation. You need official documentation proving full mental competence. Second, we file for a cease and desist regarding the POA and begin formal petition for reversion." I nodded. "Third, and most important, we gather proof. Emails, transfers, voice messages, anything that shows deliberate misuse of your authority." She looked up at me, eyes steady. "You ready for this?" I didn't answer right away. I just opened my ledger, pulled out the first receipt with Paige's name on it, and placed it on the desk. "Been ready," I said. "Just needed someone to aim with." The first real crack came from something they probably thought I'd never see. A receipt buried in the inbox I rarely used. It was an email confirmation from a shipping company. Subject line: "Your order is on its way." No sender name I recognized, just a tracking number. I almost deleted it. But then I saw the billing address, mine. The shipping address? Flagstaff. Paige's sister's house. I clicked it open. $4,899 for a full patio set. Teakwood table, matching loungers, sunshade umbrella with built-in lighting. Luxury stuff. The kind you'd find on the deck of a resort, not a suburban duplex. The payment method stopped me cold. American Express. My American Express. The same account I'd closed 6 months earlier when I decided I didn't want credit cards hanging over me anymore. I even remembered cutting it in half at the kitchen table, right before June's birthday. I'd felt proud, like I was cleaning house in more ways than one. I dug out my ledger, flipped to the credit accounts section, and ran my finger down the columns. There it was. The closure confirmation code, the date, even the name of the representative I spoke to. I didn't just close that card. I documented it. I sat back and stared at the receipt again. Paige had used a debt account, not one that expired. One I shut down. She must have had the number saved in some autofill setting on her device. Probably didn't even think twice. Which told me one thing. She didn't think I'd notice. Or care. I forwarded the receipt to Elaine with one line. She's using accounts I no longer have access to. This one's closed. I have proof. Her reply came 5 minutes later. That's theft, Richard. Digital or not, that's our breadcrumb. I'd spent months feeling powerless, watching them repurpose my life like I was already gone. But that email, that one misstep, shifted something. They weren't just entitled. They were sloppy. And I wasn't confused anymore. I wasn't hurt. I was documenting. It was the first hard piece of evidence. The first domino. And I knew there'd be more. Back at the duplex, I pulled out the lockbox from under the bed. Fireproof, heavy, one of those things you don't think much about until you need it. Inside was everything I'd filed away out of habit. Insurance records, appliance manuals, the title to my truck, and most important, hard copies of my correspondence with American Express. I'd printed the email from when I closed the account, highlighted the closure confirmation number, and written, "Shut down, June 12th, in block letters across the top in red ink. It felt overkill at the time. Now it felt like insurance. I laid the receipt Paige used beside the closure letter. Same card number. Same account name. A transaction made 3 months after the account was officially dead. But it wasn't just the date that mattered. It was how she made the purchase. The email confirmation included device metadata. Nothing fancy. Just a footer line that said, ordered via iPad OS Safari 15.3. It listed the device name, Paige's iPad. They always name their devices after themselves. I pulled up my laptop, the one they didn't know I kept, air-gapped, and never connected to my home Wi-Fi, and logged into my backup email. The one I used for things like online orders and medical stuff. The shipping email had forwarded there too. From the message header, I traced the IP address. Took me all of 15 minutes. Old construction guys don't forget their systems. We just apply them differently. IP matched the address of Paige's sister's house in Flagstaff. That tied the transaction to a closed account. Used without permission, confirmed on a personal device, routed through a network I could prove wasn't mine. I compiled it all into a PDF. Screenshots, annotated dates, metadata highlights. Sent it to Elaine with the subject, confirmed misuse, tied to physical location and named device. Her reply was short. We're not in the gray anymore, Richard. This is criminal fraud. I sat back in my chair and looked around the duplex. The floor tiles were still cracked, the air still dry. But for the first time, the place didn't feel like exile. It felt like a command post. The voicemail came at 10:42 p.m. I was sitting at the kitchen table, poring over bank statements with a mug of black coffee gone cold, when the phone buzzed. Ryan's voice. Flat. Controlled. Dad, why are you making this legal? We can just talk. No apology, no questions. Just the quiet push of someone trying to steer things back into silence. I didn't call him back. The next morning, I couldn't access my checking account. The ATM gave me an error. I tried online, locked. The savings account too. Even the utility auto-pay bounced. At first I thought it was a technical glitch. Then I got a call from the bank manager, a woman named Lisa I'd worked with for years. "Mr. Ashland, I'm sorry to inform you we've had to temporarily freeze your accounts pending a wellness report filed with Adult Protective Services." I asked her to repeat it. "Wellness report," she said again. "Filed anonymously. It claims there's concern over mental competence. It gives us cause to lock financial movement until further review." I didn't have to guess who filed it. Elaine got on it within the hour. She subpoenaed the report. The intake notes included a call log with a phone number attached. It was Paige's work number. They weren't trying to slow me down. They were trying to erase my ability to move. No money, no access, no say. They wanted me helpless. They wanted me to panic. But they didn't know I'd already pulled copies of every account, every document, and stored them off-site. They didn't know I had a second bank lined up, accounts already opened. Elaine had walked me through the process last week. Just in case. This wasn't just selfishness anymore. This was war. They were treating me like a dying man grasping at legacy. What they didn't realize? I wasn't dying. I was waking up. They tried to discredit me to bury the truth, but every time they pushed harder, they told me exactly where to dig. They weren't protecting their future. They were accelerating mine. Elaine got the APS report after 2 days of legal back and forth, and when it finally came through, she didn't even need to open the transcript to know who had made the call. The report had been filed anonymously, with vague claims about mental decline and erratic behavior. But the intake form had one field they couldn't scrub, the incoming phone number, which matched Paige's office line exactly. That alone would have been enough to rattle most people. But what came next was worse. Not just because of what it showed, but because of how careless they'd been with it. Venmo, not mine, Paige's sister's. Elaine had filed for access under discovery, and once we had it, we sat together and watched the arrogance of amateurs unfold right in front of us. 27 transfers over 6 months, all small enough to stay under the radar, each labeled with either blank spaces or a string of emojis they must have thought were clever placeholders. A chair, a flower, a house. Chair, hibiscus, house. But every symbol pointed back to a charge I had already logged. The patio furniture, the landscaping, the interior redesign that Paige said was just a refresh and totally budget-friendly. They'd used my old cards, then quietly paid each other back behind closed doors, laundering the trail through casual app payments like they were playing house with someone else's money. They were counting on me being too old to connect the dots. They forgot I kept ledgers, not feelings. Elaine built the file like an indictment. Screenshots, dates, dollar-for-dollar matches between the charges on my defunct accounts and the Venmo transfers bouncing between Flagstaff and Phoenix. When she finished, she didn't even look up from her screen. "This isn't just unethical," she said. "It's organized." And I knew then, it was never about helping them get on their feet. It was about what they could drain from me before I caught on. What they didn't realize was that I wasn't trying to fight them emotionally anymore. I wasn't out to win back respect. That ship had sailed. What I was doing now was simpler. I was building a record they couldn't lie their way out of. Not in court, not in arbitration, and definitely not in front of June's trust. Elaine called on a Thursday morning, early, her voice too sharp to be casual. I could hear the flipping of pages in the background, the kind of sound lawyers make when they find something other people missed. She didn't waste time with greetings. "You're going to want to sit down for this," she said. I was already sitting. Same kitchen chair, same cold coffee, same window looking out at the same cracked sidewalk. But something in her tone made me grip the table edge a little tighter. I pulled the full trust language, she continued, not just the summary from your file, the original binder from the day June signed it, which you both notarized at my office 15 years ago. There's a clause in there I don't remember ever needing until now. And that was when she read it to me. Not just the standard fraud provision. I already knew they'd broken that. This was deeper. Hidden almost. Buried in legal phrasing that most people skim over. But Elaine had learned to read like a surgeon reads scans. In the event a listed beneficiary commits an act of coercion or financial misrepresentation against the grantor, said individual shall be considered to have renounced interest. In such case their line of inheritance shall be bypassed in full, and secondary heir shall assume standing. I didn't breathe for a moment. Secondary heir? I asked, barely able to get the words out. Yes, Elaine said. And you're going to want to hear who it is. She paused, then dropped the name like a gavel. Lily, my granddaughter. Ryan's daughter from his first marriage. The one Paige never acknowledged. The one they stopped bringing around once she turned 14 and started asking hard questions at dinner. She hadn't stepped foot in that house in over 3 years, and last I heard, she was working nights to put herself through school after Ryan told her to learn the value of struggle. June had named her as backup, quietly, without ceremony, a hedge against exactly this. And now? Now she stood to inherit everything. The house, the trust, the future they thought they had locked in, with paperwork and pressure. It wasn't just a legal shift, it was poetic. That night, I sat alone in the duplex with every light off, but the one above the sink. The kind of soft yellow glow that doesn't pretend to warm anything, just lets you see what's still standing. The ledger sat open on the table, June's trust paperwork spread beside it, and in the center, between all the evidence and outlines and typed legal terms, was a framed picture of her from the garden, straw hat tilted back, lips parted mid-laugh, knees dirty from pulling weeds she never quite managed to conquer. I hadn't touched that photo in months, not because I forgot her, but because I couldn't look at her without remembering all the ways I'd let that house slip out from under me. I thought I was being generous. I thought family needed grace. I thought Ryan was just tired, and Paige just high-strung, and that eventually everything would balance out, because I'd built a foundation strong enough to survive a few bad seasons. But foundations don't mean anything when someone's digging under them every day you're not looking. I missed my garden. I missed the rusted gate latch that squeaked just enough to let me know when Lily was sneaking in to surprise me. I missed the sound of June humming while she watered things we both knew wouldn't survive the heat, and the way she used to say, "Even the stubborn ones bloom eventually, if you don't give up on them too soon." What I had now was tile that echoed when I walked, and a chair that creaked wrong, and the kind of quiet that doesn't soothe, just reminds you who isn't coming back. And the part that stung the worst wasn't the fraud, or the money, or the legal games they tried to play. It was knowing I invited them in. It was knowing I handed Ryan the keys, not just to the house, but to the life June and I spent decades building, and that he didn't hesitate to give them away when someone else asked for more room. Not even a pause. I looked down at the trust papers again, traced Lily's name with my thumb, and felt the first real thing in weeks. Not rage. Not sadness, clarity. Elaine didn't believe in surprise attacks. She believed in documentation, deadlines, and letting people walk into their own consequences with their eyes wide open. So we set the meeting properly, not in my home, not in her office, and definitely not on neutral ground where anyone could play dumb or emotional. We chose Redstone Title and Probate, a firm with no emotional stake in the outcome. Just polished wood, clean folders, and a conference room wired for audio recording and legal observers. Noon on a Friday, 10 days after Elaine confirmed Lily's position as sole backup beneficiary. Invitations were sent formally, notarized letters, signatures required. I signed mine at the bank. Paige RSVP'd through email with a smirk you could hear in her punctuation. We'll be there with our lawyer. Good luck. Elaine just smiled when I read it to her. That tone only exists when people think they're untouchable. Ryan didn't respond at all. We spent the rest of that week preparing, not just for the facts, but for the games we knew they'd try to play. The emotional hooks, the faux confusion, the wounded tones that came only after they'd been caught. Elaine didn't just prep documents. She walked me through every scenario, what to say, what not to react to, when to let silence do the work. She was surgical about it. 3 days before the meeting, she called in a neutral clerk to record the session. She had the conference room locked for a 2-hour block and arranged the seating so that I would sit across from them with the full trust binder laid out like a map between us. No screens, no phones, just hard facts and cold light. By the morning of, I felt no anxiety, no dread, no curiosity about what they'd say, only readiness. Because once you've been stripped of your home, your name, and the memory of who you were in your own family, you don't care what someone says anymore. You only care what's proven. And by the time they stepped into that room, they wouldn't be defending their actions. They'd be sitting inside them. They arrived 12 minutes late, acting like the room owed them something. Paige wore a sharp white blazer that looked like it had never been sat in. Ryan looked like he hadn't slept, or hadn't wanted to. He didn't meet my eyes, didn't try to shake my hand. Their lawyer, a young guy named Trent, carried a laptop, and the kind of face that thought being louder meant being smarter. He didn't nod at Elaine, didn't even introduce himself, just took his seat like we were wasting his time. Elaine stayed seated when they walked in. She didn't speak until the clerk turned on the recorder and gave her the nod. This meeting has been requested by Mr. Richard Ashland. The clerk began, voice flat and practiced. Purpose: review of the Ashland Family Trust, current standing of power of attorney, and identification of misuse or misrepresentation of authority. Paige crossed her legs and smiled, like we were all here for some inconvenient paperwork snafu. Elaine motioned for the clerk to lock the door. It clicked, and then she began. She didn't warm up. She didn't give speeches. She slid the first folder across the table with surgical precision. Let's begin with the power of attorney, she said, flipping to the notarization page. This document was filed without legal certification. No witness, no stamp. It contradicts all prior declarations from Mr. Ashland and bears a signature inconsistent with every verified record on file. Trent leaned forward. With respect, we believe Mr. Ashland may not have full cognitive capacity. Elaine held up her hand. We'll get to that. Then came the second folder. Unauthorized financial activity. Credit accounts used post-closure. Orders traced to devices not registered to Mr. Ashland. IP logs confirmed. Paige shifted, her smile tight now. Elaine wasn't done. Third folder. The trust. She turned it so they could read the highlighted clause. Any act of intentional misrepresentation shall result in permanent disinheritance. Paige laughed. Short, harsh. This is nonsense. He's not even lucid. Elaine pulled out a sealed envelope, opened it slowly, and laid down a recent certified psychological evaluation. Clear, signed, dated. Richard Ashland is of sound and unimpaired mind, she said calmly, and the room stopped pretending. Elaine didn't waste time letting them regain their footing. As soon as the evaluation report landed, she turned the page and began distributing the rest, one packet after another, each labeled, each clipped, each one a slow unraveling of the story they'd tried so hard to script behind closed doors. First came the side-by-side comparison of my real signature, pulled from notarized mortgage paperwork and verified medical directives, against the power of attorney they submitted without a notary. The differences weren't subtle. The slant was off, the loops malformed, and the pressure inconsistent. She'd even brought a handwriting specialist's preliminary notes to show exactly how the forgery faltered under scrutiny. Trent tried to object, but Elaine wasn't looking for their agreement. Next came the timeline of credit card activity. Every charge tied to accounts I had formally closed, with the closure confirmations and transaction dates highlighted in yellow. She included screenshots of the shipping confirmations, device metadata, IP logs, and one image that showed the billing name, mine, lined up beside a delivery address that belonged to Paige's sister. No explanations, no embellishments, just proof. The third packet was thinner, but heavier somehow. A clean printout of the clause from June's trust, highlighted in 2 colors, one for the condition and one for the consequence. The sentence was unflinching in its simplicity. Any act of intentional misrepresentation shall result in permanent disinheritance. Elaine didn't read it aloud this time. She let them read it themselves. Paige shifted in her seat again, no longer smiling, her hand twitching near the folder but never opening it. Trent finally spoke, but his voice had lost its edge. None of this was ever explained to my clients. They were under the impression. Elaine cut in, steady as ever. That's not a legal defense. Ignorance of the clause doesn't negate the clause. Your clients used fraudulent documentation to gain financial control. That alone activates disqualification. Ryan's voice cracked, barely audible. We didn't know. But Paige turned toward him so sharply it felt rehearsed. You said it was airtight. Elaine leaned back, calm but relentless. This isn't about what they knew. She glanced toward the recorder, then back at the clerk. It's about what they did. It wasn't a moment of shouting or courtroom drama. It was the kind of shift you don't notice until your balance is already gone, like standing on a dock and realizing the tides left you floating. Trent went pale first, his hands hesitating over the laptop keyboard, his mouth still slightly open like he had a rebuttal in mind, but no words that would survive being said aloud in a recorded room. You didn't tell me about this clause, he said finally, not to Elaine but to Paige. His voice low, like maybe, if he kept it quiet enough, it wouldn't count as panic. Elaine didn't respond to him. She turned instead to the clerk seated near the far end of the table, her voice calm but unmistakably direct. Please log that the power of attorney submitted on behalf of Mr. Ashland was presented without legal verification or certified consent, and that financial activity associated with that document has been independently confirmed as fraudulent. The clerk nodded once, typing steadily, his fingers tapping the keys in the kind of rhythm that sounded a lot like a closing door. Elaine continued, her tone unchanging. Also logged that psychological assessment provided by certified third-party evaluation confirms Mr. Ashland's full mental capacity during the relevant time period. That was when I saw Paige's hand drop from the folder. Trent looked from her to Ryan, who still hadn't spoken again, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere on the table that didn't require him to look at me. Elaine's voice didn't rise. She didn't deliver a speech. She simply opened the final folder, slid it across the table, and let the printed notice inside speak for itself. Activation of Clause 17B. Authority reverts to the original grantor. All amendments made under fraudulent conditions are null and void. Then she turned back to the clerk one last time. It's logged. And just like that, it was done. Everything they'd built on that paper, the access, the entitlement, the quiet confidence that I'd just let it all slide, collapsed under the weight of one recorded sentence and a stack of documents they never expected anyone to check. They hadn't lost control in some big cinematic moment. They had simply run out of lies. It didn't take long for the weight of what had just happened to settle into the room, though none of them wanted to be the first to speak in its full gravity. Ryan finally broke the silence, his voice cracking under the weight of something that sounded less like guilt and more like panic, like someone waking up in the middle of a storm they thought they'd planned for. "Dad, we didn't know," he started, but the words fell apart halfway out of his mouth, and whatever explanation he thought he could offer found no place to land in that room. Across the table, Paige snapped toward him, her voice sharp enough to slice the quiet in half. "You said it was airtight." It wasn't a question. It was a verdict. Trent, still seated between them, closed his laptop without a word and began slipping documents into his bag with the careful, embarrassed motion of a man who knew he had just lost a case his clients never deserved to win in the first place. He didn't ask for copies. He didn't ask for next steps. He just gathered his things, like someone cleaning up after a mess that wasn't entirely his, but also wasn't unfamiliar. Elaine waited until the last paper was zipped away before she addressed them, and when she spoke, she wasn't cold, just exact. That made it worse somehow. By invoking Clause 17b, she said, "Mr. Ashland has regained full legal control over all trust assets. Both of you, having been found in breach of fiduciary expectations and named directly in misuse filings, are now removed as beneficiaries, effective immediately." Ryan swallowed hard, but Paige didn't move. She stared at Elaine like the words were still buffering. Then she looked at me, for the first time all day. Not in anger, not in shame, but with something quieter, heavier. Disbelief. Like she never actually imagined a world in which I would stand up and say no. Elaine stacked the final documents, stood, and motioned for the clerk to end the recording. As the red light on the device went dark, so did any remaining illusion that this had all been some kind of misunderstanding. They hadn't just been confronted. They had been recorded. And now there was no version of the story left where they got to play innocent. By the following Monday, Redstone Title had begun the reconveyance process, quietly, efficiently, without the need for further confrontation. The house, once tied up in overlapping ownership documents and backdated amendments, was reassigned in full to my name. No more conditions. No more loopholes. It was mine again, not because I fought for it in some dramatic, emotional outburst, but because we proved, line by line, that I had never legally let it go. The joint accounts were next. Elaine filed the closures herself, attaching the misuse reports and invoking her authority as my legal representative under reversion. Each account was dissolved, with all activity logged and flagged with the bank's fraud division for permanent record. The financial institutions didn't argue. The evidence was too clean, the timeline too precise. Then came the final stroke. Elaine submitted a formal affidavit of misuse to the county court, not to press criminal charges, not yet, but to create a public record, one that would make it legally impossible for either Ryan or Paige to file claims on the trust, the house, or the remaining assets down the line. It wasn't about revenge. It was about prevention. This was about making sure they didn't come back with a new lawyer in 6 months, pretending none of it happened. A certified letter followed 2 days later, delivered to their current address, confirmed by tracking receipt. The letter was short. It stated that, as of the judgment and documentation enclosed, both Ryan Ashland and Paige Ashland were permanently disqualified from receiving any current or future disbursements from the Ashland Family Trust. No appeal, no negotiation, no return.